Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I've got our preview of Guardian Druids in Shadowlands. Here's the usual disclaimer that beta stuff is subject to change, and on that note, a set of tank changes went out yesterday with changes to every class. I've left thoughts on those changes in the pinned comment on each of the tank preview videos, but I'll just say that Monk and Demon Hunter are the only classes that were significantly affected. Monk was nerfed, but ultimately the class is still tankier than it is in BFA, and it's the tankiest class in BFA, so Monk is fine. Better than fine, actually, they're terrific. Demon Hunter's self-healing was nerfed by 25%. I think the class is now about on par with where it has been during BFA. Ultimately, even in World of Warcraft, the rich get richer, and the poor get poorer. And that's actually a good segue into talking about Druid, because there's no tank poorer than Druids. Just to be clear before we go any further into this, I'm going to be negative about Druids. This isn't hate for the class. I mained a Druid more than a decade ago. I play a Druid in every patch, and I want bears to be good. I want them to be good because I have a vested interest. I play it. It would be nice if the things that I play are good. But this wouldn't be a good preview if I wasn't honest about the state that Bear has been in really since Legion and their prospects going forward. Now let's start as we always do by talking about how Bear Druids handled in BFA. Bears are the least popular tank spec in WoW in both Mythic Plus and Rating, and for good reason. Their popularity at least became slightly more competitive in patch 8.3 with the advent of corruption effects. Bears have big health pools, Twilight Devastation scales off your health pool, so that's worked out pretty well. I regularly see crit procs above a million damage a hit on my Druid. That being said, the class baseline just isn't in a great state, and it hasn't been since the end of Legion. At the start of Legion, Bears were one of the best tanks. They had really good damage reduction tools, they had valuable group utility, they had an enormous AoE sprint with Stampeding Roar, they had a spammable magic damage reduction skill in Mark of Ursol. Then about halfway through the expansion, Mark of Ursol was removed. Bear was still useful, it had an AoE sprint that really helped out raids with boss mechanics, and the legendaries and the artifact weapon kept the class going. Then Legion ended. The powerful legendaries? Gone. The artifact weapon? Gone. The talents that increase Stampeding Roar's range were removed or nerfed, and the class's only heal had its cooldown increased by 50%, and it was put on the GCD. And the class really hasn't changed much since that point. There have been some minor buffs and quality of life improvements in BFA's major patches. Rage generation was increased. Rage costs were reduced. Damage was increased by a little bit, but not enough to make the class competitive. Frenzied Regen had its healing value increased. These were all good, but they just weren't enough, and they really didn't address the core problems. And unfortunately, the class that you log in today is pretty much the class you're going to log into after the pre-patch. So let's just start with what's being removed. Azerite bonuses and essences are, of course, going away. Fortunately, none of the Bear Azerite traits from BFA were really very good. They weren't worthless, but they mostly just gave agility or stat budget, and they didn't really do anything mechanically or rotationally. So it ultimately just kind of winds up being okay. Now onto the new skills, and there's really only one that will impact the way you play. Berserk is back as a baseline cooldown for Bears. It will work differently in the pre-patch and at max level in the expansion due to the annoying new goal of trying to always give players something new as they level up. Essentially, in the pre-patch, Berserk and Incarnation Guardian of Ursoc will grant you 50% cooldown reduction on all your Bear skills, meaning that your rotation will be Mangle, Thrash, Mangle, Thrash, Mangle, Thrash until it's over. At level 58, you gain another rank of Berserk that pushes that cooldown reduction up to 75%, meaning you can just go Mangle, 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 or Thrash, 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 depending on whether you're in single target or AoE. Also, Berserk isn't on the GCD anymore and Incarn isn't either. That is pretty nice. Berserk and Incarn also reduce the cooldown of Frenzied Regen while active, which is terrific, but Frenzied Regen is still on the GCD, which is pretty bad. It also reduces the cost of Iron Fur, and while that's good, it's a little weird. It's a cooldown that greatly increases the amount of rage that you're able to generate, and then also reduces the cost of your rage spender, making it really hard to dump effectively. I mean, there's nothing bad about having 5 or 6 stacks of Iron Fur. I just don't think a lot of thought really went into this part of the effect. It's still technically better than not having it, so I guess that's okay. Cyclone has also been brought back, but you shouldn't be shifting out to cast it. Wrath was also blah, 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 blah. And that's it for new skills. It's kind of shocking how little was added to Druid. They have a pretty big toolkit when you factor in all the stuff you can use in caster form and cat form, but bear form on its own has a very small number of available skills, so it's a little surprising to see that remain totally unchanged. In terms of bonuses you pick up while leveling, there are extra ranks to Regrowth, Frenzied Regen, Entangling Roots, and Berserk. The Frenzied Regen and Berserk ranks are both pretty good, but the other two are basically meaningless while tanking. Alright, now let's move on to changes to the base skills, and once again, I would love to say that there's a bunch of impactful new stuff here, but I don't want to lie. Iron Fur had its agility to armor conversion buffed from 75% to 100%. It was 90% until yesterday when they buffed it up to 100%. That was the entirety of the bear changes. It's a nice little buff, and it will make bears tankier against physical damage, but physical damage hasn't been a problem for bears. It doesn't really address any of the problems that the class have, and that's a concern. Additionally, Frenzied Regen was nerfed. Despite this inaccurate tooltip, on live servers, Frenzied Regen heals you for 32% of your health. That's not including buffs from talents or mastery or anything except just the base direct heal. In Shadowlands, that value is down to 24%. It does get increased by 20% from the Frenzied Regen healing taken buff, but that only brings it back up to 28%. So it's still a 4% nerf to an already not very good self-healing skill, and it weakens the other effects that interact with it, like talents and mastery. You hate to see it. Also, swipe has been capped at 5 targets. And that's it. Now let's move on to talents, but before I do, let me say, I know it's been depressing thus far if you like Bear Druid. It's gonna get worse in this section, but it will eventually get better. Hang in there, baby. Alright, there have been a couple of big changes to talents, but unfortunately those changes have mostly been nerfs. Big ones too. As always, we'll go row by row. The first tier is unchanged from BFA. Brambles is still the best single target option, and Blood Frenzy is hypothetically the best choice in AoE, as it increases your rage generation pretty significantly. This really underscores a major problem with Bear Druids that's been affecting them throughout BFA and even in Legion, albeit to a lesser degree. Rage generation just isn't a huge deal. Obviously, you need to generate enough rage to keep Iron Fur going, and you do get more damage reduction out of stacking up more Iron Furs. There can be some strategic value to layering 2 or 3 stacks up for a particularly hard-hitting section of a pull, but generally speaking, there are massive diminishing returns on rage generation. Just using arbitrary numbers from a training dummy on my copied over live character who's 480 item level, the first Iron Fur is worth 12% more damage reduction. The second Iron Fur is worth 8%. The third is around 5%. That's a pretty substantial drop off in value. In terms of the conclusions you can draw from that, I think it's this. If you tripled a warrior's rage generation or a DK's runic power, they would roughly triple their ignore pain usage or death strikes. Bear would get 13% more damage reduction out of 3 times as much rage. Class design is a complicated, interconnected web of design decisions, and it would be ridiculous to just say that this alone proves that Bear Druid doesn't scale as well as other tanks. But as a single piece of evidence, in a pretty well-supported argument that Bear Druids don't scale as well as other tanks, I think this is concerning. Really, I'm still just shocked that Blizzard didn't do anything to increase the availability of Frenzied Regen. The cooldown is so shockingly long. A more ignore pain style design where rage generation actually has meaningful rewards would work so much better. Oh well. And right, Bristling Fur is still on the GCD, so it's totally worthless. Let's stop talking about this tier. The second tier has 2 old talents and an even older one that's new again, Renewal. Renewal is pretty decent. It's basically a reusable health stone on a 90-second cooldown that you can use multiple times in an encounter, and it's off the GCD. Putting it in the same tier as a useful mobility skill, Wild Charge, and a kinda terrible mobility skill, Tiger Dash, is a weird choice. Do you want to move, or do you want to self-heal? Both, right? Alright, the third tier is where the major nerfs come into play. Each of the off-spec affinities now comes with a CC. Balance gives Typhoon, Resto gives Ursol's Vortex, and Feral gives Maim. So obviously this is an indirect nerf to the value of Feral affinity, and it's a major nerf to the value of Bear Druid in general. You no longer have access to the Ursol's Typhoon combo, which was one of the only things the spec had going on for it that was cool and unique among tanks. Not only can warriors do it better with Spear of Bastion, bears can't even do it at all now. You really hate to see it. Also, the Resto skill Swiftman has been redesigned, and it now has to consume a regrowth, rejuve, or wild growth that's already active on the target. This is a substantial nerf to the value of Resto affinity. One of the main draws of playing Resto affinity in BFA in Mythic Plus was the ability to Typhoon, which requires you to be balanced now, run away, shift out, and Swiftman yourself, then shift back into bear form and keep tanking. At least you'll have Ursols, I guess, but the whole collection of affinities is weaker than ever. In the fourth tier, it's mostly business as usual until you reach the end of the row. Technically, Mighty Bash has been nerfed. They added 10 seconds to the cooldown and reduced the duration by 1 second. It's not the end of the world, but it doesn't make you feel great about being pushed into it as the replacement for Typhoon either. Mass Entanglement is exactly the same. Heart of the Wild is interesting, and it could be useful in a variety of situations, but it's clearly more of a raid talent than it would be for Mythic Plus. The potential, again, in raids, to shift out of bear form while the other tank is tanking and be an extra healer during some kind of major environmental damage phase is interesting. I mean, I would never want to do that. It sounds like torture, but maybe to some people it would be fun and powerful and appealing. The potential to empower your cat weaving or owl weaving is also interesting, I guess. In Mythic Plus situations, I just don't see how this could ever be useful. When are you doing combat in Mythic Plus but not in bear form? Virtually never. The fifth tier is mostly unaltered. The Frenzied Regen and Iron Fur components of Berserk are rolled into Incarnation, and it now grants 30% more max health instead of 15% extra armor. This is a pretty big buff to an already nice cooldown. With Berserk baseline, picking up Galactic Guardian means you still have an offensive cooldown. I would probably still run Incarnation in most situations because the rage generation from Galactic Guardian is pretty low value, and doing more burst damage with Incarn is generally more valuable than the sustained damage output you get out of Galactic Guardian, but it's an option now. This tier is good. The sixth tier is the same as it is in BFA, although the small nerf to Frenzied Regen makes Guardian of Elune even weaker. Earth Warden is still terrific, especially in AoE. Survival of the Fittest is unchanged, but there's a combination of a conduit and a legendary that could make it pretty appealing. Tough as Bark reduces the cooldown of Bark Skin, and the Natural Order's Will makes it a substantially more useful defensive cooldown. At max rank on that conduit and using Survival of the Fittest, you can get close to 50% uptime on Bark Skin, and it would be worth 35% damage reduction. You have to sacrifice a lot of power elsewhere to pull that build off, and obviously it's not great in between the Bark Skins, but that's potentially a very tanky setup. It's interesting. And in the final tier, again, things are mostly unchanged. Rend and Tear is still simple and terrific, and it's probably going to remain the go-to talent in like 95% of situations. Lunar Beam is still horrendous, and its 75-second cooldown is weird and doesn't line up with anything. Pulverize has been changed from a minor defensive gain that sacrifices damage to a small single target defensive cooldown that sacrifices damage. Because it's single target only and has a good bit of setup and requires you to give up damage, I don't think it'll really ever be useful over Rend and Tear, but there is a chance that in raids it could be useful for very specific sections of hard-hitting fights. So just to recap, I think there are some interesting changes to Bear talents, especially later in the tier. The biggest change is no longer being able to take Ursol's Vortex and Typhoon, and that's a really noticeable nerf. I hate it. I have become more positive about bears the more time I've spent playing them, but my initial reaction in testing was, what was Blizzard's plan here? They saw bears were the worst, least popular tank, and so they decided to nerf them? Why? Rotationally, Bear hasn't changed much at all. Berserk being available baseline is nice. It means you aren't required to spec into Incarnation to have access to a pretty awesome offensive cooldown. Although there is a decent chance you still will, in which case the class is pretty much exactly the same. Alright, we've made it to the most important section of this video. We've covered everything that's changing for the base class. We're about to move on to all the new Shadowlands features and bonuses, which are actually pretty cool. But first, I'm going to ask the three most important questions about the class. Is it good? Is it fun? And how does it compare to other classes? Okay, first, is it good? It's okay. It isn't bad, but there is a reason it has been unpopular for the last expansion, and I don't really expect Bear Druid to make a big jump up in popularity in Shadowlands. That doesn't mean you can't do everything you want with it. You can push Mythic Plus, you can kill bosses and raids, and Bear Druid will do just fine. Druid's the most popular class in the game, and Bear is the least popular tank in the game. There's a reason for both of those things. If Bear's your off spec and you still want a tank without gearing up another character, or you love Bear Druid in spite of BFA, then Bear is great. If you're looking for a class to be your main tank character, or you want to know what's going to be a popular tank in Shadowlands, Bear doesn't seem like it's received enough changes to jump out of last place. I think the biggest problem with Bear Druid, and this will be very apparent during the pre-patch, is that all of the good things about the class, all the fun stuff, is hidden in the end-game systems. Covenants, legendaries, and soulbinds all add a lot of value and flavor to a pretty boring bland class. As I'm about to get to in a minute, they legitimately do make it stronger and more fun, but the base package wasn't great in BFA, and I think it's safe to say that the base class has actually been nerfed from BFA. Is it fun? Surprisingly, yes. Bear is a lot more fun in Shadowlands than it has been in BFA, and that's due really to two main reasons. First, Azurite bonuses for bears sucked. They were boring and awful. Second, the Druid Covenant abilities and legendaries are very interesting and actually have meaningful interactions with each other and with the base class. And finally, how does it compare to other classes? The other of the two big problems with Druid is that Blizzard has tried to make the class too versatile. They aren't just bad. I think that would be a lot more fixable. If the class just needed a bigger health pool, or more armor, or more self-healing, that's easier to diagnose. But no, Druid can do everything, sort of. It can provide a huge burst of spot healing. It can shift into cat or moonkin form and throw out a ton of single target damage. It can combat res. It can decurse. It can remove enrages. It has AoE CC, and so on. The problem is, tanking isn't something you can just shift out of in the middle of a challenging fight. If you shift out of bear form to throw heals around while you're tanking, you're dead. Nearly all of the utility that Guardian Druid can do in bear form, such as using Decurse and removing Enrage, using Ursol's Vortex or Typhoon, but never both at the same time, all of that can be brought by a Resto Druid or a Balanced Druid. And they can actually use Ursol's Vortex and Typhoon together. Those are specs that are already much more popular. So I ask, as I've asked myself and Blizzard many times, why bring a Bear Druid instead of another tank? They have so many abilities and talents dedicated to the idea that you'll shift out of bear form, which you can't do while tanking. The utility they have while in bear form is limited and provided by other, more popular specs. They don't do a lot of damage. They don't have a lot of self-healing. Their defensive cooldowns are limited. What do they do? And the answer seems to be they get overlooked by Blizzard and not played very much by the community. And that's a shame. Well, on that down note, let's move to Covenant abilities. There are a few interesting options here, so let's just get right to them. We'll start with a Kyrian Covenant. The signature ability is Summon Steward. You summon a friendly little non-combat minion who gives you a reusable health potion that also removes curses, diseases, poisons, and bleeds. It's on a separate cooldown from your regular health potion and health stones, so it's pretty nice. Your steward can also function as a vendor or a respec tome. He's a helpful little guy. I'd argue he's the most all-around useful of the signature abilities, especially given Druid's somewhat limited self-healing tools. The Druid ability is Kindred Spirits, and it's complicated, and I hate it. I'll skip to the conclusion here and say I think this is actually the worst Covenant ability in the entire game. Apologies to Necrolord Demon Hunters. Anyway, the way it works is it's a skill you have to cast onto a party member prior to combat, and it lasts for an hour. It gives you an instant skill that's on the GCD that you can use with a 1-minute cooldown and a 10-second duration. As Guardian, it will redirect 40% of the damage they take to you. So it basically works like a really strong Blessing of Sacrifice, except it's a Covenant ability, and you have to put it onto the target before combat. So, you know, that's not the end of it, but obviously, that's not great. Why not just play a Paladin? Here's the other half. You also get a buff for that 10 seconds based on the spec of the player with whom you've linked. If they are a tank, they take 40% of your damage taken. This means it can work like an external cooldown that can go either way if one of you is actively tanking and the other isn't. It doesn't reduce the amount of healing your healers have to do, but it will reduce the burst damage one of you is taking by 40%, and that's really good. Unfortunately, if you're both actively tanking, this will just split the damage you're taking with them and the damage they're taking with you, meaning that it won't do anything. How do you make a Covenant ability that doesn't do anything? And as much as this sucks, we're still not done. If you link to a healer, you probably will wind up wasting the Blessing of Sacrifice component of the effect. Maybe you won't. Sometimes healers do take a lot of damage, but generally speaking, they don't. If you're linked with a healer, during the 10 seconds the buff is active, you'll be healed for 30% of the healing they do. This is clearly the best of the potential links for you. It was nerfed from 50%, but still, it's got potential. It's not a defensive cooldown, but it is a decent healing intake cooldown. That's okay. Lastly, if you link to a DPS player, you gain 30% of their damage done as your own damage done, or your own healing, or your own shielding. It doesn't just directly convert their damage into damage coming out from you. The way it works is it gives you a buff when they do damage. And as you do damage or healing, it adds a percentage of the damage stored in that buff into your damage and healing. It's been a bit since I tested this, but what I found was that I could not do enough damage to consume the whole buff as Bear before the duration on it ran out. Again, you're having to decide who to link with before combat starts. Technically you can cast it on someone mid-combat, but it's got a decently long cast time, so you really don't want to be doing that while you're tanking. As a result, you can't just reactively throw your Bear sacrifice onto someone as a damaging effect goes onto them like a paladin can, and you can't reactively use it as a self-healing or DPS cooldown when a party member's about to pop their healing or DPS cooldowns or whatever, even if you could make full use of their DPS cooldowns. It's going to be useful to some players in very controlled, specific circumstances, there's no question, but Paladin Sac is so much more versatile and simple to use than this mess of a skill. The conduit for it reduces the cooldown. It's not bad. I would like it more if the base ability were better. Oh, and also, if you use it while solo, it gives 10% damage reduction. And it's on the GCD. It's horrible. Alright, please let me move on to the Necrolords. Their Covenant ability is Fleshcraft, and it's a 4-second channel that isn't interrupted by damage. It grants you a shield worth 20% of your health pool, although that can go up to 50% if you're standing over the corpse of an elite. This is my least favorite Covenant ability. For tanks anyways. After killing a pack in a mythic dungeon before you move to pull the next one, this can be a decent bonus, and it is a good bit better for Druid than other tanks due to their enormous health pools. It's still not great. It's a better option for non-tanks, and it really is just a drop in the bucket compared to even the self-healing that a Bear Druid can do. The Necrolord Druid skill is Adaptive Swarm, and it's pretty cool. I think it's my favorite of the Druid Covenant abilities because it's very well designed. It's a stacking dot that jumps back and forth between allies and enemies, and the stacks on it don't impact how much damage or healing it does, only the amount of jumps left. It has a longer base duration than its cooldown. This means you can have multiple charges floating around on separate enemies or allies. You can cast it onto enemies right before it's about to expire so that it will refresh and they'll be dotted for longer, and it jumps smartly. It tries not to merge with other buffs when possible, and it will jump if the target it's on dies rather than just wasting the buff entirely. It offers a steady stream of damage and healing, and because it also increases the effectiveness of your dots and hots, it's a solid, consistent DPS increase thanks to Moonfire. It also works with Thrash's dot, but Thrash's dot is pathetic. I found it to be worth about 10 to 15% of my damage on its own in single target, and about 5% more total damage from Moonfire and Thrash. 15 to 20% more damage from a Covenant is pretty respectable. Unfortunately, it doesn't scale into AoE at all. That's a real concern. If you choose to Catweave or play Feral Druid for real, this power can up the damage of your Rake and Rip, and I guess it's probably a pretty decent option for Resto and Balance. It's pretty good. The conduit for it increases the dot and hot increase, and again, not bad, but not great. Next we have the Night Fae, and they are by far the most druid-y looking of all of the Covenants. Their signature skill is Soul Shape, which gives you a modest speed boost that you can reactivate to blink forward 15 yards. It looks great, but it shifts you out of bear form, so it's pretty much worthless. Huge bummer. The Druid Night Fae ability is Convoke the Spirits, and while I think it's somewhat popular among the community, I am not a fan. It's a 2-minute cooldown, 4-second channel that casts 12 random Druid spells. It chooses skills partly based on your shapeshift form, so in bear form it'll prioritize Thrash and Ironfur, but it will still randomly throw around Moonfires and Wrath and Rejuve. The potential to get some extra self-healing is alright, and obviously it's useful as a burst damage cooldown, but I just really do not like the idea of channeling for 4 unhasted seconds while tanking. It doesn't get its duration reduced by taking damage, but insofar as I've been able to test, it doesn't look like you can dodge while channeling either. It's really hard to test, but I've failed to dodge like 40 hits in a row while channeling now, and I feel comfortable with that. The problem with this ability is that it's doing 12 random druid skills. Those are like the worst kind of skills you could ask for. If it were 12 warrior skills or 12 monk skills, this would be pretty cool. If it were less random or the skills were somehow stronger than their crappy base druid versions, that would be cool. As it is, you just get 12 random skills in 4 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. That's pretty boring to me. And that's a shame because of all the covenants, this is the one I would want my druid to be. The conduit for it just increases your damage and healing while it's active. Again, pretty boring. It's basically just the same as the Necrolord conduit. No mechanical interaction. Not bad, but not interesting. And last is the Venthyr Covenant. Their signature ability is Door of Shadows, which is a ground-targeted teleport. This can be useful for teleporting past Trash and Mythic Plus, and it does give Druid a decent source of mobility, which they absolutely need more of. It has a cast time, which isn't great, but still, you can never go wrong with more mobility. The Druid class ability is Ravenous Frenzy, and I hated it at first. A big offensive cooldown for Bear Druid. Okay, cool. Increase the damage of a class that does no damage by 20%, and it's going to do no damage still. And the potential to lose the buff early and take a huge hit of damage because you got stunned by a mob or kited and spent 1.5 seconds idle seemed like trash icing on a garbage cake. But then I played around with it and some legendaries, and the potential to combine this Covenant skill, Incarnation, and the Legacy of the Sleeper legendary is very nice. Legacy of the Sleeper will absolutely ensure that you're not going to waste any of this effect, and it's a terrific damage synergy over the top. This is not a source of constant damage, obviously. Picking this up means you are sacrificing the consistent DPS of the Necrolord's Adaptive Swarm, and it also means you're locking yourself into the Legacy of the Sleeper legendary setup, and probably Incarn as well. It can still work with the baseline Berserk, of course, but you want to layer all of your offensive cooldowns together, and Incarn is a stronger, longer cooldown than Berserk. There's also the concern that this is a 3-minute cooldown, and that legendary drops Berserk and Incarn down to 2.5 minutes, so you're wasting a little bit of that legendary. All of those negatives being said, this gives Bear Druids a terrific offensive cooldown combo. It's all off the GCD, so you can easily pop it in a single macro and go wild. Also, the conduit for this one is clearly the best. I'm able to get up over 20 stacks by the end on my copied over character and around 18% or so on a very badly geared pre-made. So even with bad gear, we're talking an average of 20% more crit while the whole offensive cooldown combo is going. That's awesome. The only complaint I have is the whole thing is 3 minutes, which is a really long offensive cooldown. When you consider that warriors are getting like 45 seconds on Avatar, and I think pallies are around a little over a minute on wings, 3 minutes seems like an eternity. It does seem really nice for DPS specs to gain another cooldown though, although I don't know how it competes with Necrolord. I would assume Venthyr is better because burst damage is usually more important than sustain, and this scales into AoE whereas Necrolord does not. So giving letter grades to all of the Covenants, I would go D+ for Kyrian. I hate it, but I can see it being useful for specific circumstances for high-level players. B+ for Necrolords because it's very good and consistent in single target, but it is not good in AoE. B- for Night Fae because it's a useful burst damage cooldown, but it's random and unreliable, and Soul Shape is essentially worthless. And finally, A+ for Venthyr. I think that's the only A+ I've given out. Their signature ability is terrific. It's exactly what Bear needs. The whole offensive combo as Venthyr is extremely powerful. It's a really appealing and fun setup, and it doesn't have the same single target constraint as the Necrolord ability. I think the only downside is feeling like you'll be forced into a specific legendary, but it's a really good legendary. It's just not a bad trade. There's almost no downside. Ultimately, I think there's a chance Llarold could wind up being the best option for sustained raid damage, but I really still think it's going to be Venthyr, and Venthyr will clearly be the best option for Mythic Plus. On top of all the Covenant systems, Shadowlands is also bringing back Legion legendaries, but this time with targeted crafting. Even better, bears actually have quite a few pretty cool options. I'll start with the bear-specific ones and then move on to the general druid ones. First, I've already mentioned it, but I'll say it again, Legacy of the Sleeper is back. It was the artifact weapon ability, and I loved it, we all did. I wish it were part of the base class, to be honest. There isn't a whole lot else to say that I haven't said already, but I'll just repeat the important part. It makes your one offensive cooldown much stronger and much more defensive. It's unfortunate that Berserk and Incarn aren't available more often. Still, it's very strong, probably the best option in virtually every situation. Next is Lufa-infused Embrace, which has great synergy with Rend and Tear. Unfortunately, Thrash's damage really isn't that substantial, so a 20% increase to its damage doesn't really wind up adding a ton of damage outside of pretty large scale AoE, which all the AoE caps in the game are trying to push players away from. It's the most consistent all-around option, and it is pretty good. It just doesn't have the same potential to perform as well as Legacy of the Sleeper. The Natural Order's Will I also mentioned earlier during the talents section, and I'll just say again, it makes the potential Barkskin-oriented build very appealing. Getting somewhere in the range of 30 to 40% uptime on Barkskin that grants 35% damage reduction is pretty crazy. You really do sacrifice a lot of damage output and other power to get this though, so I would say it's still pretty interesting, but you know, probably not useful in a lot of situations. Either way, it's definitely the tankiest legendary available to bears. And last is Ursoc's Lingering Spirit. This one kind of steps on the other Thrash legendary's toes, and it really doesn't do as good of a job. Would you rather do a constant 20% more damage or have a 15% chance to do double damage? The double damage could be better in a very short span of time, but over any sort of longer fight, the 20% constant damage clearly wins out, and it has other positives going for it too. I just don't see a reason to ever use this. Alright, on to General Druid legendaries, and I'll start with Circle of Life and Death. The name is pretty metal, but it basically just makes your dots do 25% more damage. You'll have to refresh them more often, but that's not a problem as a Bear Druid. It's a pretty good damage increase, and it synergizes with the Necrolord Covenant ability and the talent Galactic Guardian very nicely. There's a chance this could actually be the best setup for single target and cleave DPS. It really doesn't have any defensive value though. Draft of Deep Focus is next, and it's another very similar legendary. They keep taking the same idea, doing it twice, and making two different pieces out of it. Basically, this only works in single target, and it only affects Moonfire, Rejuve, and Cat dots. As a result, it would be the best DPS option if you're cat weaving, and if you're not, it would just be weaker. It's simple, but probably not very good. Lykara's Fleeting Glimpse automatically casts a spell every 45 seconds while you're in combat based on your form. That sounds complicated, but basically, it's useful for either giving yourself a free Barkskin, which is pretty good, or gaming it to cast free Starfalls, which can deal an enormous amount of AoE damage. That's pretty nice, but you have to be in AoE, of course, and you really need to be aware of everything that's going on to make use of it. You'll need to shift right before it's coming up. You'll obviously want to knock back and CC everything that you're tanking before you shift to Moonkin form so you don't get obliterated, then quickly shift back. It also provides no defensive value, and you'll need to be balance affinity, so you'll lose out on some healing from resto affinity by doing that. It's potentially a big offensive gain, but it requires a ton of sacrifice to pull it off, so I would say it's probably not worth using most of the time. And last we have Oath of the Elder Druid, which is a big passive defensive increase and potentially very, very good if you're choosing to cat weave or owl weave. Again, that DPS weaving component would be worthless in Mythic Plus, but the other parts are not. And the potential healing gain if you're running Resto Affinity is also pretty good. This legendary increases Thick Hide from 6% damage reduction to a constant 10.5%, and Resto Druid would go from 3% of your health healed every 5 seconds to 5.25%. It's a very simple, very decent legendary that could be useful as a defensive option for both Mythic Plus and raids. Alright, legendary recap. There are a bunch of appealing options. I think Legacy of the Sleeper will be the best option if you're going Venthyr, and Lufa-infused Embrace will be the best if you're going Necrolord, I guess. But Circle of Life and Death and Oath of the Elder Druid could both also be useful. I have to say Druids have a pretty nice collection of legendaries. And here we are almost at the end. I started off pretty negative on Druids both in testing and in making this video, and I actually think there's a pretty decent justification for that. Blizzard has added some really cool powers and bonuses to the class. Unfortunately, those bonuses are all locked away in the endgame systems. Legendaries, Covenant abilities, Conduits, and even Torghast powers for Druids are all powerful, game-changing, and especially in the case of Torghast powers, very, very fun. The base class and the talents, on the other hand, aren't just lame and weak. I think it's fair to say the base class has been nerfed from BFA. So you'll log in on pre-patch day and play a class that's weaker than it was the day before. If Druids had been the #1 most popular tank class like Monk and Warrior, that might have made sense. But no, Monk is stronger than ever and Warrior's still pretty competitive. I really don't want to go out on a down ending here, so I'll end on this. Even though things are looking a little dark for Bear Druids in the pre-patch and early on in Shadowlands, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. This class was extremely good in Legion with a very similar design, and I think it's within Blizzard's ability to bring the class back to being a competitive tank in Shadowlands. Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about Guardian Druids in Shadowlands, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands content, and thanks for watching. Bye.